The extent to which the first attempted assassination of President Trump has been erased from our historical discourse is remarkable. Right after 20-year-old Thomas Matthew Crooks shot Trump in the ear at a rally in July 2024, and Trump avoided death purely because he happened to turn his head at the right moment, the shapers of media and political narratives began working to turn attention away from this event. It certainly would have been beneficial to use the attack for justifying some new campaign of censorship or doxing, yet both liberals and the right were hasty to shift towards other projects, such as the renewed effort at attacking Venezuela's revolutionary government, which Washington launched that summer. Many have pointed out how Trump's operation to capture Nicolas Maduro has come at the same time that Trump and others in his circle are facing intense scrutiny over their role within Epstein's crimes. And these speculations are essentially correct, just for a different reason than such observers usually assume. It's true that the leaders of the American empire seek to use spectacular acts of violence to quell the growing opposition towards them, from both inside the USA and abroad. But to understand the form this violence is taking, we must investigate the system of control that its orchestrators use, a system that runs on the sexualization, abuse, and weaponization of children, with the latter having a quite literal meaning. Ideologically and spiritually speaking, this system's roots are within the network of satanic cults that the Anglo elites have been constructing for many centuries now, which act as the other side of the coin to Christian colonialism and imperialism. These categories are part of the same system. It's just that the role of the satanic side is to terrorize the masses and to maintain a system of blackmail for those who enter into the political establishment. Such realities have been discussed in detail by numerous commentators on the Epstein case, which has largely expanded mass consciousness about the extent of ruling class pedophilia. The part of this story that I will cover is the one where these abuses against children are being used to engineer an ever-intensifying onslaught of violence, mainly in the form of shooting sprees. I'll also talk about how this war against America's own people has the potential to spiral out of the control of those behind it. Immediately following the 2024 U.S. presidential election, there was a lack of social disruption that sharply contrasted what many had been expecting. The last two elections had precipitated historic divisions among Americans and great unrest, yet now things were almost disconcertingly quiet. Then, in early December of that year, the world was shaken by an incident of American violence that would inspire sympathy for the attacker, and not just from the niche political communities, but from many regular working people. This was the slaying of Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare CEO, who had been responsible for denying vital medical services to thousands of people. Whether Luigi Mangione is a fall guy for the Brian Thompson case has yet to be determined, but Mangione immediately became seen as a figure of hope for much of America's masses. The sentiment behind the Luigi movement is one of support for self-defense, including against the kinds of aggressors who inflict violence upon the underclass through social murder. It was a development that went against the designs of our ruling institutions, one that needed to be countered. And it was this newfound sense of urgency among the elites, whose plans had been going fairly well but were now faced with a threat, that gave special significance to the events that would soon follow. On December 16th, 2 weeks after the Thompson shooting, the Abundant Life Christian School in Madison, Wisconsin, experienced a shooting that would capture special attention. This was because it had been one out of the very few school shootings in which the perpetrator was female. Among those who looked deeper into the crime, though, it also became associated with the same satanic and neo-Nazi circles that have had a role behind many other shootings. Natalie Samantha Rupno, the 15-year-old who murdered another student and a teacher before taking her own life, had left behind numerous clues about what kinds of external influences contributed to her actions. Clues like how Rupno had been part of a Telegram channel that put her into contact with members of 764, an organization which extorts minors into self-harm and coerces them into being sexually exploited. Writes Ali Winston from Wired about how this group gains psychological control over these children.
The abuse perpetrated by members of comm groups is extreme. They have coerced children into sexual abuse or self-harm, causing them to deeply lacerate their bodies to carve cut signs of an abuser's online alias into their skin. Victims have flushed their heads in toilets, attacked their siblings, killed their pets, and in some extreme instances, attempted or died by suicide. Court records in the United States and European nations reveal participants in this network have also been accused of robberies, in-person sexual abuse of minors, kidnapping, weapons violations, swatting, and murder. Some members of the network extort children for sexual pleasure, some for power and control. Some do it merely for the kick that comes from manipulation. Others sell explicit CSAM content produced by extortion on the dark web. Their main aim is to traumatize you, says Anna, a young woman groomed and victimized by 764, one of the most notorious groups under the comm umbrella. They want to make you suffer, and for you to take your own life. They are really very sadistic people.
764 is part of a network that's connected to the Temple of Blood, the U.S. offshoot of the global neo-Nazi satanic terrorist organization O9A, Order of the Nine Angles. Rupno's connections to this structure of influence were not limited to an association with one Telegram user. This is evident in how Rupno, while writing her manifesto, used language that could only have come from the ideas which O9A propagates. Rupno referred to Arda Kukaskitium, the 18-year-old Turkish neo-Nazi who had stabbed 5 people in August 2024, as a saint, which is the word that this terror network uses for whites who kill on behalf of the race war. The system for radicalization that this network uses is called the Terrorgram, which provides targets with the indoctrination materials to ensure they become fully immersed in the ideology of racial genocide. In the weeks following the Madison shooting, at least 2 other aspiring or successful shooters would show themselves to be connected to Rupno, and by extension the grooming circle that had handled her. First, a 20-year-old man in Carlsbad, California, was revealed to have been talking with Rupno about planning to attack a government building on the same day that Rupno would commit the shooting. Then Solomon Henderson, the 17-year-old who committed a shooting at his Nashville school in January 2025, was revealed to have been behind an account that commented encouraging Rupno to livestream the Madison attack. As our society reckons with the reality of how much sway elite pedophile rings hold over our institutions, we must also confront the question: if the most powerful forces within government are systematically abusing children, could they also be using these children to carry out acts of violence, or make them into adults who do so? In the midst of the recent trend towards increased political violence that many are calling America's years of lead, this question is especially important to investigate, because it lets us understand the ways that this trend could be manipulated. Our government certainly doesn't want events like the killing of Brian Thompson to become what defines the years of lead. It would prefer for the prevailing developments to be attacks against the broad masses of people, as this is what can keep the masses demoralized and atomized. To figure out how this project at Sowing Chaos works, we need to look at the history of how its modern methods were developed, and how figures such as Epstein made the project into what it is today. In his 2004 book, Programmed to Kill: The Politics of Serial Murder, David McGowan illustrated the context behind what was likely the first instance of a staged American mass shooting. He pointed out how right before this shooting happened, in 1972, the country had been shocked by the latest serial murder incident, that being the slaying of 8 women, which was allegedly committed by Richard Speck.
Just days after Richard Speck, whose crudely tattooed arm declared him born to raise hell, was arrested in Chicago, Charles Whitman, a former U.S. Marine sharpshooter who had received training by the Naval Enlisted Science Education Program, NESEP, an intelligence entity, ascended to the tower of the University of Texas at Austin and unleashed a barrage of firepower on the unsuspecting campus. By the time it was over, Whitman and 14 others lay dead, and another 31 victims were wounded. The night before the rampage, Charles had killed his wife and mother, although it was his violently abusive father for whom he was said to have had an intense hatred. Whitman had also left a note, which read in part, "I don't quite understand what is compelling me to type this note. I have been to a psychiatrist. I have been having fears and violent impulses. Both of these mass murders, one in Chicago, Illinois, and the other in Texas, took place just weeks after Anton LaVey had formally established the Church of Satan and declared April 30th, 1966 to be the first day of the Age of Satan. Whitman's rampage occurred on August 1st. Lammas on the occult calendar. Just 3 weeks prior to LaVey's pronouncement, longtime CIA asset Henry Luce's venerable Time magazine had asked its readers the symbolic question, "Is God dead?"
McGowan concluded that these events surrounding Whitman's attack were relevant to it and indicative of a greater design to terrorize society, because based off of his research, this was a perfectly logical idea. Programmed to Kill's thesis is that when you look at the circumstances and evidence around the 20th century's alleged serial killer cases, it becomes apparent that the serial killer phenomenon is a manufactured psyop, designed as a cover for covert CIA operations. Operations that replicate the methods the United States has used for waging war against the people of Vietnam, El Salvador, and the other countries where Washington has worked to create mass-scale trauma by committing gruesome murders. According to the story that McGowan pieces together, the famous serial killers of the post-war World War II 20th century were all merely figureheads for a hidden network of coordinated killings, one that works in tandem with the globe's child trafficking operations. None of them acted alone. Even when the killers had participated in the crimes, they did so while being enabled by law enforcement, as in the case of Dahmer. In cases like that of Bundy, many of the murders couldn't plausibly have been committed by the figurehead, meaning a hidden team had been responsible for many or most of the murders. In cases like that of Speck, the evidence supposedly tying the accused to the murders didn't even make sense, meaning that the supposed serial killer was nothing more than a patsy for explaining murders which had gone unsolved, and perhaps weren't meant to be solved. What consistently appears throughout the examples McGowan goes through, though, are stories in which people grow up being seriously mistreated, and then thereby come into contact with aspects of our society's institutional systems for troubled youth. Systems like the military, the prisons, and the psychiatric care centers, which could easily gain opportunities for involving these already traumatized individuals in the Cold War's mind control experiments. Experiments that the CIA invested in, not just to create spies, but to create soldiers who could emotionlessly kill via the influence of hypnotic commands. Using the same infrastructure that's been behind the efforts to transport and sexually abuse children, U.S. intelligence, military, law enforcement, and political institutions have created a machine for funneling vulnerable individuals into a life path where they can be made into these figureheads. and a critical part of this assimilation process has been psychological abuse against these individuals, often of the same kinds that come from a child being sexually assaulted. This practice of calculated abuse, posits the book, is what explains the recurring phenomenon where those who've participated in these crimes have had a tendency to disassociate. Such was the case for Kemper, Dahmer, and numerous others. This doesn't necessarily mean they had all been molested as children, though plenty of them absolutely were, but it did mean that they couldn't have come to such a state without being subjected to some type of trauma. Because for someone who hasn't previously experienced a dissociative disorder, essentially the only way that they could be brought towards multiple personality disorder is through trauma that the mind cannot tolerate, and that it responds to by retreating into a new persona. It's with this context that we can understand the methods which O9A and its international branches use for turning its grooming targets into killers, between the original CIA mind control experiments and the strategic psychological attacks carried out by groups such as 764. The procedures follow the same outline. There's even a verifiable link between U.S. intelligence and this modern satanic network that's adapted the mind control model for the online age. Reports events in Ukraine on the federal agents who've been coordinating O9A's activities within the Ukraine war and other U.S. operations.
Today's first topic is the British founder of the O9A, David Mayat, and his links with British intelligence. Like most bad things, it all started in England, and naturally it metastasized in the USA. Today's second character is Joshua Sutter, the proven and proud FBI agent who did the most to transform O9A philosophy into a global propaganda machine for the creation of school shooters, child abusers, and serial killers. It should be noted that both Sutter and Mayat have not simply significantly influenced the neo-Nazis in the post-Soviet world, they also seem to actively cooperate with them. In fact, Sutter was actually invited to the 2018 Pact of Steel conference in Kiev by Ukraine's Azov movement. Azov is now Ukraine's most well-known military unit, actually a number of units, which is feted by the government and liberal press as the undisputed masters of war, the only figures capable of saving the country and reforming the army. Back in 2018, Sutter brought along with him members of Atomwaffen, a US-based neo-Nazi right-wing accelerationist organization. Some claim that Mayat was also present at the conference.
O9A has served a key role in the transition towards the modern version of the last century's serial killer operations, a transition in which the standard form of domestic governmental terror is no longer ritualized homicides that happen over the course of days, weeks, or years, but rather rapid shooting attacks of the kind that Whitman carried out, and where, in a large proportion of cases, the ones who have been programmed to kill are children, which have been roped into the system's grooming networks. When Nicholas Cruz, the perpetrator of the 2018 Parkland shooting, had his search history read out in court, some familiar trends emerged. In between when the 19-year-old Cruz had been trying to find child pornography or looking up Nazi songs and paraphernalia, Cruz had typed in how to do a satanic ritual. Upon looking at the life Cruz had been experiencing during his most psychologically formative years, it becomes more apparent how he had been led to these types of thinking and to the actions which came after them. It also becomes clear that authorities had at least sought to minimize what was happening to him. In 2016, when the Florida Department of Health and Families was called upon to investigate accusations that Cruz was being victimized by his mother, the DHF asserted that it found no indicators of abuse or neglect as alleged. It also reported that Cruz was receiving mental health treatment and medication from an independent behavioral health organization. If Cruz had been approached by federal agents during his experiences with the mental health care system, or during his attempted ventures into online white supremacist and child porn communities, this would have only been a continuation of the established practice in which mind control experimenters have sought out susceptible individuals. It also wouldn't have been a deviation from the FBI's war on terror practice, in which agents regularly manipulate mentally ill or disabled people into going along with plans for terrorist attacks. And then the FBI busts them so that it can claim to have stopped numerous terror plots. During these sting operations, the agents are fully in control of the situation, with the targets merely acting as puppets for their suggestions. But according to the conventional logic of American law enforcement, these plots were going to happen regardless, as the guilty parties are assumed to have already been on the path to murder. How many of the shootings that we've seen in this last generation have simply been versions of these setups, in which the manipulation target, rather than being foiled, was allowed to actually realize the violent plans the handlers placed into their minds? This is the new standard model for domestic covert operations. Radicalize vulnerable individuals into killing, using a combination of the old mind control tactics and indoctrination which makes someone consciously glorify the idea of violence. Something important to note about the latter tactic is that when you're trying to get somebody to genuinely believe in an idea, it's best to start doing so when the person is still a child. This is a basic fact about brain maturity, one that pedophiles obviously take advantage of, and that, in the last 30 years, has also increasingly been taken advantage of by the mind controllers who were behind the serial killer trend. It was within this new project of the internet age, where children were to largely replace adults as the assigned perpetrators of mass murder, that the network Epstein was part of could be put to use. Epstein was not the one who created the infrastructure of child trafficking, and it didn't go away when he left the picture. Epstein was only assigned to facilitate one part of these operations, by what many speculate to have primarily been Israeli intelligence. These connections to Israel have been confirmed. Israeli Directorate of Military Intelligence, Ari Ben Menashe, has said that Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were working with Israel's military intelligence as far back as the 1980s. The public is already widely aware of Epstein's links to Israel, and of the blackmail operations that wealthy pedophiles like Epstein are instrumental in facilitating. The deeper part of this story is that Epstein, and the powerful Zionist figures who he was working with, have also played a part in the project to weaponize children. Epstein's role in this project was to advance the methods for manipulation that have been instrumental in the efforts to recruit children into becoming weapons. Methods where grooming victims take on the role of bringing other children under the manipulator's control. This is a standard way that human traffickers gain sexual slaves, by using proxies to deceive the targets into believing that if they take on the job the trafficker offers, they'll gain access to a better life and won't be abused at all. The ideal recruiters are peers of the targets in age, and satanic cults like Temple of Blood are undoubtedly aware of this. When they cultivate online communities filled with teens who are experiencing mental health crises, and who share a desire for suicide which goes along with murder, they're applying the tactics Epstein used when he had underage girls bring other girls into the trafficking ring. The bigger role that Epstein had in this, though, and the one which shows his methods to be linked with the domestic covert ops, is the role where Epstein let financial monopolies gain special market access. In terms of foreign policy and global banking, the practical purpose of sexual abuse operations like Epstein's is to ensure that Washington can maintain a system of control in international diplomacy. This is why, as discussed in Program to Kill, U.S. State Department officials are consistently supplied with child sex slaves so that they can be blackmailed. Such tools for internally enforcing a consensus are instrumental in U.S. foreign policy, with the Zionist lobby being the most prevalent and infamous example of this. And the central driving force behind this entire structure of control, that being financial speculation, has been revealed to be connected with orchestrated murder in ways more direct than anyone could have guessed. After Thomas Crooks was killed at the scene of his crime, and tech platforms made an effort to erase his online footprint, we found out several notable things about him. That he had been using special encrypted accounts overseas, that he had been featured in a commercial for BlackRock at his high school in 2022, and that he had searched for major depressive disorder. We know little else of his background, but with the context of history, it isn't hard to piece together a likely story about how he'd come to where he ended up. If the people Crooks had been talking to through these encrypted platforms were federal agents, these agents would have long been able to detect that he was somebody with the kinds of psychological vulnerabilities they're looking for. And BlackRock's visit to his school was indicative of this, because BlackRock has close ties to U.S. intelligence. BlackRock, Blackstone, and the other biggest financial monopolies are some of the most common places for former CIA officials to start careers in. The appeal of these firms is in how, when you've already gained access to high-level intelligence clearance, and therefore know which countries the U.S. is planning to target next, you'll know where to place your firm's international investments. This is no doubt the calculation process that these financial institutions are making right now in regards to Venezuela, Iran, and the other places where Washington is seeking to forcibly open up new capital. If BlackRock had a role in the plot to assassinate Trump, it did so because the faction of the intelligence community which controls BlackRock wasn't confident Trump would have the will to carry through the next big imperialist plans. But if there were a consensus within our deep state that Trump needed to go, Trump wouldn't have been allowed to win, because the CIA is certainly capable of assassinating a U.S. president when it has sufficient internal desire to. The Crooks shooting was not something that's since been repeated, and this is no doubt because Trump has proven himself to be willing to fully submit to the blackmail structure. A fissure within the ruling establishment was repaired, and the second Trump administration carried out what's essentially been a more extreme version of Biden's policies. The genocide against Gaza has been accelerated, the war against Russia has continued, and new wars have been launched against several countries. The U.S. government has felt secure in pursuing these escalations because the American people are so unorganized at this stage. Their ruling class feels it can act without any real concern for public opinion. Yet the Luigi movement has proven that, though the mass organization is not yet there, there is a mass revolutionary sentiment. This is no doubt why, when a man went into Blackstone's headquarters in July 2025 and shot the firm's CEO, the media decided to minimize coverage of the event, while portraying the attacker's motive as apolitical. Our ruling institutions do not want us to have a conversation about how these financial firms have destroyed so many people's lives in a way equivalent to how the healthcare industry has. What they want us to focus on is the fear that comes from when our government's terror operations get activated and our communities experience traumatic assaults against the innocent. In August 2025, soon after the Blackstone shooting and in the midst of new plans for war escalations, one of these operations was able to shock our society in a way that will last, at least as much as these events can last in our memories during an era when they've become so frequent. Minneapolis, a city which has functioned as a hotbed for state-created tragedies, with George Floyd's killing and the murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, saw one of its Catholic schools attacked by a 23-year-old shooter. Robin Westman, who killed 2 children and injured 17, had left behind indications of how far the project at influencing vulnerable youths has gotten since the old serial killer era. What stands out about Westman is that in addition to having described a life of severe depression and having trafficked within the same satanic neo-Nazi circles other shooters have, Westman admitted to being a regretful transitioner. Tired of being trans was one of Westman's named motivations, with this translating into a hatred towards humanity that would become concentrated in certain areas that Westman's influences steered their target towards. An example of this was found in one of these statements Westman wrote on the gun, which read, "Kill Donald Trump." It is uncertain whether Westman had ever been prescribed SSRI drugs, but even if this wasn't the case, this story includes a different kind of failure by our physical and mental health care systems. The problem of individuals who transition, not having truly informed consent beforehand, and being set on a path that they can't go back on if they regret it. This problem has opened up an entire new frontier for mind control operations, with new kinds of opportunities to influence the targets. The goal, in the broadest terms, is to turn our years of lead in a trajectory that makes our society unable to handle the trauma it's experiencing. Like the minds of individuals such as Westman haven't been able to carry the weight forced onto them, these operations are about making us break as a collective and accept the next actions by our ruling elites. An example of someone who our medical system has failed, but who has been able to carry the weight which comes from this, is Luigi Mangione. Mangione had undergone a back surgery that wasn't done properly, as observed by surgeons who weighed in on his case. The chronic pain from this left him isolated and in despair, which an entire society of people could relate to. This has earned Luigi admirers, who've reached out to him while in prison, including one person who wrote to him asking, "How do you remain so chill?" Luigi replied,
"Jules, I spent 1.5 years living on a broken spine that I could feel sliding around every time I stood up, walked, or rolled over in bed. To exist in such a state, your physical being, split in two, is an endless mental and physical war within itself. After you have fought and won internal wars, nothing external, nothing can ever faze you."
This is a lesson that can assist us in the next phases of popular struggle, where the apparatus will intensify its attempts to terrorize us. Luigi has provided hope to millions, and the movement behind him will sustain that hope until the American people have won this battle.